Hello everyone, this is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at debrarrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the annual plan and also to download a training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. So I attended an accounts payable conference in May where I had a few speaking sessions where I talked about the vendor process and how authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices can help vendor teams avoid fraud, regulatory fines, and best practices. Now, when I go, I like to talk to as many people as I can, and sometimes I am still so surprised about how many are not doing some of the more well-known vendor process steps. So today, I'm going to talk about 3. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 191, 3 of the biggest mistakes vendor teams make. So, like I said, I attended an accounts payable conference in May, and it was in Florida, and it was in person, and it was very well attended. And I actually love going to conferences because my introvert turns into an extrovert, and I talked to everyone. So I had 3 speaking sessions, might have been 4. And then outside of that, actually within the speaking sessions, and then just outside of that, I talked to other accounts payable practitioners just to see what their pain points are. And I just love talking accounts payable and especially vendors. And so I did that. But I was still, and I don't know why I'm still so surprised because I know what the issues are in accounts payable. It's hard to do some of these things. But there are 3 basic things that really need to be done that have been around and forever, and people are doing them, but still not everyone. And I just don't get that because especially now, post-pandemic, fraud is still trending up. And so doing specific tasks in the vendor setup and maintenance process can help you avoid fraud and then continue to help you avoid compliance fines and just overall bad vendor data, which could lead to duplicate payments. I don't talk about that as often as I should. So there are really 3 things that I want to talk about, but I do want to acknowledge first, because it happened to me too, right? Many vendor team members or team leaders or managers most likely started in the larger accounts payable range or function. And accounts payable is a function that you just don't major in. And even when you get training in accounts payable, it's not accounting system or ERP specific. That's usually on the job. So you have to figure out how to make what you want to do work in that particular system. And even if you find someone, because I mentioned the conference and they didn't do it this year, but in past years, they have had organized breakout sessions by ERP. But even when you do that, it can be helpful But so many different companies or so many companies that have the same accounting system or ERP have it configured completely different. So if anyone is out there with SAP, you know what I'm talking about. But it can be with any version of a system, right? You can make certain fields required. You can link some of the vendor master fields back to the customer side. So there's just so many options, even if you have the same accounting system or ERP and the same version of it. And so a lot of what you're doing is on the job learning, on the job training. And as there's turnover of team members, and I know that has been a big concern this year, then it's on the job, person to person training. Hopefully you have desktop procedures, especially if you've been impacted by the Great Resignation, because one of the fears, right, is that you have a very knowledgeable team member that exits out of the door without fully training their replacement because maybe you weren't able to hire anyone in time before that person left. So some of the activities that were being done were lost and are no longer being done. But I will say the 3 that I have here, I thought that they were top of mind for every vendor team. So we're going to start with the first one. And the first one is vendor validations. I talked with more than I want to admit that we're not doing the IRS 10 match. I thought everyone was doing that. I actually had to give out the website a couple of times for irs.gov e-services in order to sign up to do it. And it's free on their site too, by the way. And if you are one of the ones that are not doing it yet, let me explain why you want to do it. One, you want to collect the W-9, and the W-9 will have the legal name and the vendor's tax ID on it, and you want to compare that legal name tax ID combination with IRS records. And you want to do that for 2 reasons. One, because you want to make sure that it matches. So if that vendor is reportable, then when you do your filing, you won't get a notification back from the IRS saying that the legal name tax ID combination that you filed is not valid. And so at that point, now you've got to go through a whole nother manual process to send out the B notices to the vendors to collect W-9s. And that is very manual, and you don't want to do that. So you want to make sure that you do that IRS 10 match. The other thing that it does, because I know some folks will say, well, my vendor is not reportable, or you're not going to pay my vendor more than $600 for the year. And everyone seems to know that threshold for reporting 1099s, even though some payment types have lower thresholds. And neither you nor they, and when I say they, I mean your vendor or your internal employee that's pushing back on submitting that W-9, which sometimes the internal employees can be worse than the vendors. But no one knows how much you're actually going to pay that vendor. It's June now at the time of the publishing of this podcast. How do you know that between June and December that there's not going to be an unexpected purchase of goods or services that you're going to pay the vendor? And you can't always say too that you don't need one because it's a corporation, because in some cases for certain types of payments, even if the company is a corporation, they're still reportable. And so you always need to collect that W-9 and do the 10 match to make sure that the legal name and tax ID match. So if you have to end up reporting on them, you won't get a notification from the IRS. But the other big reason is you just want to make sure that that vendor is real. You want to put a roadblock between you and fraudsters by requiring that W-9 and require it to be signed, even though the IRS does not require that you collect the W-9 to get the tax ID. Technically, you could get that over the phone for payments that are reportable on the 1099 MISC and the 1099 NEC, right? But you want to collect that form and you want to require it to be signed so that you can put at least one more obstacle between you and a fraudster that's trying to get by. And if you put an obstacle like the W-9 and required to be signed in their way, they will just go to the next potential victim that is not asking for that. So you do want to collect the W-9, you do want to do the IRS 10 match, but that's just one of the validations. And that IRS 10 match is free. And I have 4 other free validations that you should be doing if your company is a U.S. entity. And I do have a webinar coming up on June 21st, and I'll put a link to that webinar in the show notes. But even if you're listening to this after June 21st, it will be a recording, or it'll be on demand. It'll be recorded, and so you can listen to it at your convenience. And it is only 30 minutes, so it's not a big part of your day, or won't take out a big part of your day. So make sure you register for that. And if you're not able to attend live, you'll get a link to the recording. Or you can just go on my website, DebraRRichardson.com. Again, that will be in the show notes, and you can navigate to the webinars page whenever you go and either register for the live or register to watch the on-demand recording. So I'll have 5 vendor validations that are free that every U.S. entity should be doing, like, no matter what. And IRS 10 check is one of them. So you got 4 more that you can learn about. All right, so that was one. The second one is not inactivating vendors. That actually is a big one. This one I kind of do understand because it is a mostly manual process. And why do you want to inactivate your vendors really on a consistent basis? That is because the less active vendors you have in your vendor master file, the less vendors that you have that are accessible for both internal and external fraud. Not only that, but after a certain period of time, that information is considered stale. And if you haven't done business with a vendor in, let's say, 15, 18, or 24 months, whatever works for your company, consider that information stale and inactivate that vendor. That means that if the vendor, or if your company wants to do business with that vendor in the future, then you're going to collect all new supporting documentation, perform your validations, and again, don't forget to register for that webinar for the 5 validations, or actually, the 4 that you'll learn of, new ones that you'll learn of. But do those validations and just make sure that that information is still valid. Sometimes even vendors that you are doing business with will not notify you, or will notify whoever they have a relationship with in the company, and then that information does not make it to AP. So if you've got vendors you haven't done business with in, again, 15, 18, or 24 months, you need to inactivate those vendors. Now, what do I consider an inactive vendor? That is a vendor that has not had invoice activity, payment activity, purchase order activity. And then I also like to look at the last modified or modified date on the vendor record, because the whole point is to make sure that the vendor's information is updated. And if they've already updated it, then you can take into consideration that activity, because maybe they know that they're going to, supply your company with some goods, and, a purchase order is coming. And so they want to make sure their information is up to date. So if they've already done that, you can take that into consideration. Now, I get asked quite frequently how often this process or inactivation process needs to be done. And my answer is always monthly. And then I get like these looks, because I do understand that many of these accounting system and ERPs don't have an automated way to inactivate vendors based on 18 months or 24 months or 15 months of inactivity. And that means that it's a manual process, and it could be as manual as exporting reports or data from your accounting system or ERP, consolidating that information into an Excel or Google Sheets file, and then doing that manual analysis. I will say, though, that I do have something to help you here too, and I'll put a link to two on-demand webinars that I have on YouTube where you can just, I have it time-stamped and you can just skip around to where you want. But the first one is 8 steps to clean your vendor master file when you're doing it manually. And it does talk about how to inactivate your vendors as step 1. And then I have a second one that I walk through tools that I use when I clean my client's vendor master file. So you'll get the process in one webinar, and then you'll get some tools that you can use in another webinar. And a great example of that is if you want to check for like duplicate vendors, but you have, your vendor list and you have your vendor name. Somebody fat fingered the name, or somebody put the in one of the vendor's records that is a duplicate, but you won't find it because when you sort it, it's not going to sort in order. So I've got a tool for that. So look for the links to those webinars in the show notes as well. And then the last one, the number 3 that I have as the third biggest mistakes that vendor teams make is training and security awareness. Now, I do understand that your IT teams, that your security or InfoSec security teams, or whomever it is at your company that handles your security awareness, they may have some training in place. And I know it fluctuates between companies at how often that training is done and who gets that training. And there's also, and maybe your company does this as well, where they do these phishing tests, right, to see who clicks on the link, and then that person gets extra training. So I do know that that's out there. Not every company does it, and not every company does it very often. And so what you need to do and your team members need to do is just to make sure that you are staying up to date on fraud trends, right? The new scam alerts that are out there, because every time we get something and put an internal control in place, fraudsters, cyber criminals will find a way around it. It is always evolving. And so you do need to be kept up to date on these new scams, which since the beginning of the pandemic a couple years ago, I have been posting new scam alerts on my site at least 2 to 3 per week, and sometimes more. And when these new scam alerts come out, these are things that are reported by the FBI, by the IRS, and other organizations and media outlets. And when they report those, it means that they've seen those, or other people have experienced them and reported them. And so they are trying to get that awareness out. So a great example, and this came up at the conference too, because I did include it in a couple of my presentations, is that in May of 2021, there was a new scam alert that came out that said phishing scammers remove external email warnings impersonating internal users. So that means that those warm fuzzies that you get from getting an email from who you think is an internal employee because there was no external email indicator on it, doesn't mean that that's your vendor or that's your internal team member. It could be a fraudster or cyber criminal that was able to use that CSS code, and I don't know how to do it, but they have figured out how to use CSS code to remove that external email indicator. Now, had you been, looking for those new scam alerts, you would have seen that and would have known about that back in May of 2021. And then another example, and this one came out, I've been posting new scam alerts for a few years now, but this one came out in September 2019. And this one was the phishing abuse of the HTTPS. So you know how, we had always been told previously that if you see an HTTPS and that lock on the website and in the address that it is secure. Well, it turns out that the folks that issue those certificates are not doing their due diligence on these websites and the owners of them. And so you could definitely have a spoofing website or a phishing website, a fraudulent website that has that HTTPS on it. So you do need to keep you and your team members in the loop of these new frauds, new scams, so that you can recognize it when you see it, or you can take precautions if there is any other red flags, for example, on an email that you think is from your internal team member because there is no external email indicator. So just like the other two, I do have some assistance or resources for you. What I will do is I will put in the show notes a couple of different places where you can go to look for new scam alerts or sign up for new scam alerts. One is going to be the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center alerts, and they have both an industry and a consumer alerts page. And then also the IRS has a tax scam / consumer alerts page, and I'll include the link to that website as well. And they did have a nice posting that was back in April, and it was all about phone scams because the IRS is well aware, and people report to them all the time, that they get calls from fraudsters or cyber criminals, and they, threaten to arrest them or put them in jail if they don't pay their balance due via a gift card, right? And so the IRS put a listing or a posting out there that said what they will and won't do and when they will and won't call you. And it was pretty good. Now, I will also include a link to my site, to the new scam alerts page, because I include the FBI, IRS scam alerts on my site, along with other resources that I have. And if you sign up for the new scam alerts, like, you can go to the site and you'll see them. It's a lot. But you can sign up to be notified whenever I post new scam alerts. And so when I post a scam alert, the very next day, you get an email with a list of all the scam alerts that I posted the prior day. And I usually post once or twice per week. It's at least once. And again, that is at least with 2 to 3 per week. It is still staying steady. All right, so those are what I consider the 3 biggest mistakes that vendor teams are making, especially when there are no cost options to do them. Again, I know that there are some pain points out there, but I hope that the resources that I just provided will help. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 191st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.